So, good afternoon and welcome to our webinar this afternoon, which is on economic abuse and the police, and focusing today on the training and the responses we hope to achieve. What we'll be doing today is talking to you about surviving economic abuse and SafeLives and how it have worked together for working towards the DA Matters Change programme. We'll be talking to you about the aims of the police training on economic abuse, how the training was developed. We'll be sharing with you some of the case studies and mock-up body cam footage that we've used in the training. We'll be sharing with you the responses and the outcomes from the short-term evaluation following the training, and some more recent information as well about the longer-term impact. And there'll be an opportunity for you to ask some questions as well. So I'm Jasbinder and I'm the Training Officer with Surviving Economic Abuse.
I'm Pete Williams. I'm a retired police officer, and I'm an associate of SafeLives these days, in between the gardening and the classic car maintenance.
And Jaffa Cake eating.
And Jaffa Cake eating.
We will be talking to you today about economic abuse in the context of domestic abuse, and it's really important for us to remind you all about your self-care and your well-being today. It might be that we are talking about particular themes that resonate quite strongly with you, and if you do need to seek any support, please do use the chat function. If you message the moderator privately, that's the SEA training account, and then what she'll be able to do is send you links to relevant information and support if you need that. We will be sharing some real life examples and case studies throughout the seminar this afternoon, so just be mindful of that. There is a leave meeting button, and if you do need a break, please do feel free to use that. There will be a recording of this webinar available for you to use at a later date. We are also online. There's the hashtag SEA Winter Webinars, so sharing any comments is also welcome there. We also are aware that for many people, they may have had difficult experiences with the police, particularly around domestic or economic abuse. And it's to recognise and think about how we shape that in terms of our response and how it underpins our drive to transform the police responses. For information and support on how the police can help with economic abuse, our website survivingeconomicabuse.org/resources will have some information for you as well. Surviving Economic Abuse, we're just over 3 years old, and as an organisation focusing wholly on economic abuse, we can really focus on creating a huge amount of change, and we do that through education work, raising awareness of economic abuse. And what brings us to the webinar today is that opportunity to work in partnership to improve professional practice. So a key opportunity to really craft very important and timely training for the police around economic abuse. Our work is quite broad. We work within the banking and finance sector as well. And often in those sectors, it's about recognising actually some of these systems might be inadvertently facilitating economic abuse and supporting them to shape a more appropriate response, and working to change the national laws, and so ensuring that economic abuse rather than financial abuse is now included in that definition of domestic abuse going forward.
Excellent, thanks Jasbinder. So this training, the training that we're going to outline to you, came as a result of some Home Office funding. Thanks very much to them for that, to underpin a number of things, one of them being the change to the domestic abuse definition that is coming in the DA bill when that finally lands, talking about economic abuse rather than financial abuse, about realising that economic abuse is much broader. And that training was to be delivered to DA Matters adopter forces. So for those of you who might not be aware, SafeLives developed a training programme, a change programme called DA Matters, with the College of Policing, and recently that celebrated its 5-year anniversary. There are over 20 police forces now that are DA Matters adopter forces, where a culture change has been triggered by delivery of the training to usually around 75% of the frontline response staff, and then a champions network which is set up to help sustain the change, which contains things like CPD opportunities for those champions, closer partnership working, and the hope being that the culture will be sustained and that will make a difference to outcomes for victims and survivors. DA Matters is based strongly on experience, experts by experience, pioneers, survivors, whatever you want to call those people. Their lived experience is really integral to DA Matters training. For the first time, it shows officers who may be more concerned with the criminal justice process what might be going on for victims, what's really going on, helping them to understand that and deliver the right response as a result. This workshop, which was developed in partnership with SEA, is part of a wider range of workshops for cops, which fall under SafeLives Responding Well programme. And this is about giving officers and staff the skills that they need in order to make the best decisions and in turn provide the best outcomes for victims and survivors. And that's what we're looking for here, really. We're looking for positive outcomes. As a HMIC, Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary report back in 2014 that said most officers and staff deal with domestic abuse well on a daily basis, but training was a bit of an issue. It needed to be better. E-learning has its place, but maybe not in the operational setting when you've got a billion and one other things to do. So that was part of this, but also a better understanding of the person rather than the process. And we'll come to that a bit later. And yeah, transforming the police response is right, but by giving police officers and staff the knowledge and skills to be able to do that, in a way that they can accept and in a language that they understand. So the learning outcomes from our workshop that we developed here, as you can see on the screen, as you understand already, maybe you'll come to appreciate this by the end of the session, is that economic abuse is a massive part of coercive controlling behaviour. And if you can understand that, you understand coercive controlling behaviour. Not only that, you understand how to evidence it, how to capture the adverse effect or the fear, which is what the Crown Prosecution Service will be looking for if they want to authorise a charge. Building on legislation, that's a bit like knowing what hat peg you can pin that offence onto, because if you know the offence, you know the points to prove, you know the evidence that you need to gather. And how to respond and report it, about how you're dealing with people, victims in particular, and understanding that maybe they're not ready to report at that particular time. What you can do in relation to consistency of your message, so that eventually they do see support as realistic. Understanding that many victims day to day have to manage their safety. They are the best people to understand the risk that they're at. And it might be very difficult, as part of that management process for them to disclose what's going on. That's where you've got to use your eyes and your investigative mindset, to have a look at what might be going on outside of what the victim's telling you, because, it's been since the Criminal Justice Act 2003, we've not necessarily needed to rely on a victim statement in order to take an evidence-led case forwards. So it's about spotting those wider signs, keeping an open mind, not being closed off to what's going on. Partner agencies, always very important for officers to understand, not only about the legislation, but also how they might either help people to refer to services or make those referrals. And then an understanding of what those services actually do can often be helpful if you're going to explain that to a victim. And finally, having the first name of a person that you can pick up the phone and call, to talk over a job, that's absolutely massive. So we look at that as well. And then how the domestic abuse champions in the 20 forces who receive this training, how they might cascade what they'd learned to others.
So some really powerful statements that really resonated with me when we were developing the training were these quotes from some experts by experience who support the work of surviving economic abuse by sharing examples of their lived experience and really supporting the organisation to ensure that its message is the most relevant and most appropriate. And when we're considering the impact of economic abuse on an individual, when somebody has said, I've lost myself, I couldn't do anything, I lost my life, how do we then shape a suitable response as a number of different agencies to undo the harm that's been caused by the economic abuse? So in terms of us crafting some training together, we had this unique opportunity to bring the specialism and the expertise of a police officer with myself, who's worked in frontline domestic abuse services, worked around financial capability themes, and actually quite different styles and approaches to training. But our starting point was to listen to the experts by experience, having some focus groups, having those quite open-ended conversations and capturing from them actually what had their experience been. What I'm going to do is just share a couple of voice clips as extracts of the conversations that we listened into. So what was it that somebody needed from a police response?
I needed them to remind me that it is not my fault. I am not to blame. I want them to listen to me. I want to connect with people who have shared experiences. I want to help access a network of support. I need them to recognise the effects the sustained abuse had. I want them to believe me.
Pete, did you want to say something about believing?
Yeah, and just to kind of reinforce what you're saying there. So the police's role is to gather information, it's to gather evidence, material that proves as much as disproves the person's involvement in a criminal offence. So in terms of believing, the advice that I would give to any officer is that you believe someone until you find evidence to the contrary. That way you're on a really good footing and you're going to gather the information that you need. What we're talking about here is not going to an address, maybe it's an address where you've been several times before, and thinking that you know how something's going to pan out. It's about keeping that open mind and listening to what people tell you, and believing what you're told by victims, until you find evidence to the contrary.
Absolutely. And it is in that listening that we are able to validate somebody's experience and better able to signpost them to identify an experience that they are having. Some of the conversations were again about situations and circumstances. And this was an example from a speaker talking about the fact that actually she came across as the victim not cooperating. And actually she had been called, she wasn't able to pick up the phone. While she was at home, it wasn't safe for her to pick up the phone. And actually while she was at work, she simply didn't have access to her mobile phone. And she wanted us to really present, it was about the fact that she can't talk, but can you talk? And if we ask that question, it's possibly going to help get a better response.
If I'd been asked, can you talk? Or if they had asked themselves, can she talk? It might have helped them see that I couldn't talk. But I was desperate to, and I needed their help to find a suitable time and place.
So what is life like for a victim survivor? What are the things they are having to manage on a day-to-day basis? And in terms of our response, that available opportunity, and particularly when we know that with economic abuse, something like your mobile phone is going to be controlled by a perpetrator.
This was quite interesting because both as an officer and since I've left the police, when I've reviewed BA cases, particularly looking at outcomes, like outcome 15 or 16, for example, where there are evidential difficulties or a victim doesn't support the prosecution, what I sometimes find are that there might be still outstanding inquiries, potential sources of evidence that exist, but they've been closed off. Now, you've got to take a proportionate response because sometimes the outstanding inquiries still aren't going to make a difference to the outcome. But in this particular case, I believe it was due to a victim who wasn't allowed to use their phone while they were at work. So the investigators were trying to contact the victim on regular occasions in order to see if they could ascertain that evidence, but the victim wasn't able to respond. So as a result, that inquiry was closed off, but the victim actually wanted to say something. It's just important to kind of recognise that we do need to maximise all those opportunities to to get the available evidence to get the appropriate outcome.
Often what will happen is that the economic abuse isn't actually something that the victim survivor is aware of, as many other of the dynamics of domestic abuse. And that first conversation, perhaps, in terms of reporting the abuse, is where they start to identify the situation and the circumstances. Just going to play another clip for you.
At that time, when you're so stressed you can't think, at the time he asked me, was there ever any sexual abuse? Has he ever raped you? And I said, no. But then after, I remembered a time when he dragged me off the bed, and actually, yes, I was raped. But in that moment, all I could think about was, I am in agony. I need to go to hospital. Will he come back looking for me? And that man, the officer, was chewing his chewing gum. The economic abuse part of it, that comes out after, because that is not what you're thinking about.
And when you listen to what victims, what survivors have to say, it's always very impactful. And sometimes, if you're doing your best on a daily basis to try and make a difference, it can be really difficult to hear that. But in terms of offering a service to those victims, you have to listen and understand those things that they have to say in order to tailor it and kind of make it better. And there's context in the way that you ask questions of people. Context, particularly around dash questions, the risk assessment, the identification checklist that police officers use. It's absolutely crucial in order to get a response, but also consistency in the way you do things, so that if on the occasion that you have visited that victim, they're not ready to disclose, maybe when the second officer goes, they give that consistent message again, or maybe it's the third officer that goes, that's when the victim feels that that support is realistic. And the consistency is just saying, you don't have to put up with this, it's not your fault. When you are ready, we are there to help you. And sometimes if officers have the luxury of being double crewed, you might find that one officer is asking the questions of the victim while the other is completing paperwork because they're time limited, perhaps on a handheld device or something. But unless that is explained to the victim, that might come across as that the other officer isn't interested or is on their mobile phone or doing something else. And the way that you present yourself is really important.
And for victim survivors, often they do talk about the fact that at that point, they just haven't even understood what the economic abuse is, because it does just come out so much longer after. It's just not what you're thinking about.
At that time, when you're...
Golden hour principles, that sounds like a bit of police talk to me. Pete, I'll hand over to you.
This is just simply getting as much as you can at the earliest possible opportunity, and phrases like "get it right first time" spring to mind. We know that for many reasons, a victim might call us on the nines, on 999, because at that point they fear that they're going to be killed, and the police go and they put a stop to that and they stop the victim being killed. But then getting the additional disclosure, the additional evidence can be a problem. We also know that perpetrators are very good at influencing victims and causing further fear, which then shuts down that disclosure. So as much information as we can get at the earliest stage is important, and this includes the use of body cam and the other technology that we've got, along with things like the 999 call that the victims made to the police in the first place. There's a saying in the job that if it starts off bad, it's going to end up bad. And what we're basically saying is if we can do as much as we can as early as possible, then we're going to build on that as we go through. It's harder to get it back afterwards.
Don't make them wait. Sometimes they lose it. They go off and they end up going back to the perpetrator, and the evidence collecting opportunity has gone. Try and get as much info as you can on that initial contact.
Coming to an understanding of economic abuse and trying to get an idea of what is life like for this person, what is going on. Many practitioners talk about the fact that actually their ability to have those conversations, particularly around money and finances, becomes really difficult. Just this morning I was working with some people, and one of them said, actually it's my own lack of confidence around money that actually is a barrier to me having conversations with other people about money. And it's really helpful to understand that. What is it we're trying to understand? And for many, it is about unpicking. If we are doing any kind of risk assessment, if we're generally asking people, do you have access to money? What's going on with the finances? We don't really know what to do with that information. The experts gave us some examples of what questions might have been helpful for them to have a better chance of disclosing the abuse. And here are some of their answers.
If you were asked better questions at the time, like tell us what you do as a family, what hobbies do you have, what do you do in your spare time, that kind of thing.
Getting a picture of day-to-day living for a family becomes so important. Pete?
Yeah, so police officers' questioning techniques and interviewing techniques, they're some of the best in the world. We use 5WH, we use TED, nice big open questions to get disclosures and understanding what's going on, then perhaps use of closed questions in order to help evidence points to prove. But essentially kind of asking what's going on. There's a bit of a problem here because CCB legislation is relatively new. And for many years, people who work with victims have told me that the day-to-day reality of these people, the degrading, humiliating control and abuse that was going on, was far more impactful than perhaps the physical assault or some criminal damage. But that was the only thing that the police, that those victims could come to the police about. And there's a need now, I guess, to tailor those questions to help people understand that they're not alone. It's not just happening to them, and that actually their day-to-day reality is important. So the questions that I always favour are things like, what rules exist in this relationship? Because when it comes to coercion and control, it's kind of all about rules that one person has to follow. That one person makes, the other person has to follow. Maybe there's going to be a consequence as a result of repeated rule breaks. So what rules exist in this relationship? What happens when you break the rules? How does this relationship compare to others that you've had? What scares you the most? What's the first thing you think about when you get up in the morning? These are just subtle changes. Maybe you'll recognise some of those from the -RIC, just subtle changes that perhaps help a victim to realise that actually they do understand what I'm going through, and maybe as a result I'm going to start talking about it.
Power of open-ended questions. The economic abuse part of it, as many people continually tell us, it comes out later because it's not what you're thinking about. And opportunities to do revisits are going to be so important. And many victim survivors will know that because it won't be the first time that they've sought a police response. Perhaps it might be that they have tried once or twice and then they've waited. Some of them will have an understanding of the processes as well. Pete, did you want to add?
No, I think you quite eloquently described that bit.
Right. So what do economic abuse disclosures sound like when you are trying to really listen in? What is it that you are hearing? What is it going on? And here are just some of those examples. He said that we needed a fresh start. He didn't want to live in our former marital home. He encouraged me to sell up and buy a new place by the seaside. He didn't contribute anything to the new house and even spent the unspent equity on a new car for himself. Often what will happen is perpetrators will be looking out for somebody who might be cash poor but asset rich, and there's an opportunity. So there are some changes in lifestyle and actually who gets the priority treats, what's going on.
I mean, also sometimes it's the converse. Sometimes, you know, you, as an officer, you may attend an address where the victim looks like they've got it all. A massive house, a nice car on the drive, a high profile job. But if the perpetrator has closed down their access to resources, yeah, then the reality is sometimes different. So, you know, that's when responses like, you look like you're an intelligent woman, or you look like you've got the money to do something about this and employ a solicitor, that's where responses like that really aren't helpful, because they might not have the ability to do it. But also, you know, it's not about, well, it's the old adage, it's not about why don't they just leave because then they'll be safe. It's about why didn't the perpetrator just stop what they're doing? The police, you know, we have the power to make people stop what they're doing and hold them to account.
Some other examples here. He's got a new wife now. Apparently she's working lots of hours. I think it's to help her keep away from him, actually. He's living in a house. He hasn't worked a day since they got married, and she's gone from working 3 mornings a week to full time. He's living in a house, and she's sleeping on the sofa at her sister's. When we recognise particular examples of post-separation abuse, you don't need physical proximity for the economic abuse, and often victim survivors will have a good understanding of what the perpetrator's lifestyle is, whilst they are still subjecting the victim survivor to various forms of post-separation economic abuse. He always had these short-lived hobbies, super expensive ones, all the top of the range kit, bikes, cameras, but he soon lost interest. He never paid for anything for me and the kids, and often made me pay for his new kit. Did you want to add, Pete?
Yeah, it's just interesting, isn't it? Because all of that stuff, those bikes, the Castelli cycling kit, whatever it is that you've got, the cameras, they'll probably be readily accessible in the premises when you're going to it. And we're thinking about criminal benefit. Maybe there's an opportunity to record that, you know, for work that you can do with your financial investigation unit a little bit later on, if you do establish that there's been coercive control and economic abuse.
And things to think about. If the perpetrator is working, look at what they're really spending the money on. Have a look at bank statements. Often victim survivors are told they're useless with money. You're reckless with the money. I have to look after it all. Where's the evidence? What money is being spent and who's doing that spending?
So when Jasbinder and I first got together to discuss this training and how we might put it together, it was quite interesting because we're two very different people who come with very different approaches to training, but also the experiences that we'd had in our jobs up to that point. And I'll forgive you, Jasbinder, for telling me that I looked a bit like Noel Edmonds, but what we kind of wanted to do was enable officers to really understand what was going on, and to get them to start thinking about what it would be like if they were victims. You know, So in the short term, how they might manage the loss of income or access to income or a phone or a car, how they might manage if that happened for 1 or 2 days. How about if it was a week or a month or a year or longer? And just kind of put them in the shoes of the victim, kind of get them to understand that what happens to victims could quite easily happen to them. And understanding economic abuse is a really effective way of helping people do that. And I have to concede that I didn't think that at that point that we would get officers up around tables and moving around and talking about things. But we did, and how effective was that? Getting those people to interact and sort of talk over the statements and things that we were giving to them. Every training day starts well for me if I have a bacon sandwich. That's the top left-hand picture there. But again, bringing that back to economic abuse, I'm able to stand in a room full of police officers, and talk about economic abuse and deliver that training because I'm fortunate enough to have a really secure foundation in relation to my home life, and my family, and the ability to have a shower in the morning, put my hair into the only style that it will go into these days, and have a bacon sandwich. Because I'm able to access those economic resources, I'm able to stand in a room full of cops and give that training. But it's quite easy then to understand how, if someone starts to mess with that foundation, how you can then become unstable and maybe be more susceptible to coercion and control. And we delivered once we've got all the exercises that we wanted to put into the training together, we've delivered it across those DA Matters adopter forces in a variety of locations. And the exercises that we've put in there are very interactive, but also quite impactful. And everything in the training is based on what the experts by experience had to say and real life cases. I then started thinking about how we might work what officers do every day into the training. So police officers and staff will go into people's houses, every day, when on duty, every day. And often they will go in with body worn video and they'll record things, and they'll be looking around and seeing things with their own eyes whilst talking to the victim. And it was about how could we capture maybe some of those things that weren't being talked about, but would become obvious if you knew about economic abuse, and then you could see what they were in a new light. So I got a colleague, DS Nadia Rana now, when she was a PC still, got her to come around to my house with her uniform and body cam equipment, and we mocked up my house with signs of economic abuse from real life cases. And it took maybe 3 days for me to clear out any semblance of equality in my relationship, with my wife, and consideration of the children. It took 3 days to remove all of that stuff from my house to create this economic abuse house. And as I was doing that, I kind of realised that I wasn't living in a place that I wanted to. Now I was the one who was clearing the stuff out, but I started to think about, if you're forced to live in this way, how horrible it must be. And, the impact on my wife and kids as well over that 3 days was quite telling. And I was able, I guess, to in some way stand in the shoes of an economic abuse victim and see things slightly differently. So we recorded this body worn footage, and we've dressed it with these indicators of economic abuse. Now, we're not going to tell you how many there are. You're going to have to come on the training for that bit. But I'm going to play the body worn video now, and I'd just like to maybe, through the Q&A function, through the chat function, see how many examples of economic abuse or potential examples you pick up. Yeah. We use this footage with officers in the training day, and then we will look at case studies, real life case studies, using some of the exhibits that you'll see in the training. Okay. So Jasbinder, is it coming out okay?
Yes, it's fine.
Brilliant. Just an everyday house, one that you know, similar to a house that you might go in many times a day, where those signals, those signs are around, but what are they? Now, some of the things might be really obvious, but some are less obvious, but that's what we wanted to achieve when we put this together. How much would you spot? You know, and sometimes it's about seeing something that piques your interest and then asking, you know, what's that for? What's that about? And then if you get an answer and it's a reasonable explanation, that's fine. But then if you ask about something, that might then promote a conversation about something else that's going on, or the abuse. It's also about seeing some perhaps evidence of an offence, for example, criminal damage, that might also be evidence of something else, coercive control, or particular economic abuse. And as I said at the beginning, all of the examples in our economic abuse house come from real life cases. There's been a lot of debate in the training room from the officers about whether those are handcuffs tied to the bedroom mirror there. They're not. My wife's Punjabi, and they are bracelets called Jura that she wore when we got married. So just like to make that clear for anyone that's fallen into the same trap. But you should be getting the impression that this is a bit of a man cave on this occasion, and that, you know, there's clear signs of inequality between the different people who live in this house. Okay. Hopefully that's stopped playing now, Jasbinder. So I'm just going to quickly have a look at the Q&A and chat function and see if anything's come through yet about what people saw, or how many things they might have seen. Or maybe we'll answer some questions in the Q&A in relation to that. So, locks on doors and cupboards. Yeah, real life case. Basic products for female, high value stuff for man. Absolutely. Now, you know, if both parties are using budget products because that's all that they can afford, that is one thing. But if one person's using the budget products and someone else is using high end, then that prompts a question, doesn't it? To ascertain whether there is a reasonable explanation for that. Alcohol, yeah, I mean, in my service, the amount of houses that I went into where I didn't see a scrap of food for anybody, but I saw a lot of alcohol. And I, if I knew what I knew now about economic abuse back when I was an officer, how much more effective would I have been? Loads. The receipts, the receipts are from a job where the perpetrator in this case makes the victim account for every penny they spend, and the cost and the brand, right down to the cost and the brand of the food. And when there's too many breaks of the rules, breaches of the rules, the blue tack on the corner of the table signifies what will happen to them when the perpetrator comes home later that evening for those rule breaks. The dogs. The dog is so skinny because she was 17, and that she wasn't a victim of economic abuse. So I'm happy to say. What else have we got? Open purse and receipts. Yeah. Yes, the watches. Someone's put 22 there. Have you been on this training? I wonder. I don't know. Ask the master. The note on the fridge. The guitar is just something that I play badly. That wasn't actually one of the signs. Locked bedrooms, yeah. The broken phone, yeah, interesting. The broken phone is quite interesting because if you were called to a domestic report and you saw a broken phone, then maybe you'd be thinking criminal damage. So you'd be thinking points to prove for criminal damage, the cost of the phone, whether the damage was intentional or reckless, who is the victim, and who broke the phone. But how about if that's a phone which is broken whenever the victim breaks the rules? And, it's been a couple of times now that the victim has broken the rules, and a couple of times the phone has been broken. So we're starting to talk about a pattern of behaviour rather than a one-off, that's repeated. And the phone is broken because the rules are broken, or maybe it's the glasses. So there is a pair of broken glasses in there as well. And again, you might be thinking criminal damage. But how about if the glasses are broken to prevent the victim from driving to work? The victim cannot go anywhere without their glasses. So not only can they not drive to work, they can't take the medication, they can't take the kids to school, they can't leave the house. In fact, they can't really do anything without the glasses, and they can't afford to buy a new pair of glasses because the perpetrator starves them access to money, and those glasses keep getting broken. Well, doesn't that sound like an adverse effect or a serious effect? And it's economic abuse. It's definitely coercion and control. So we're encouraging people to look at those things in new ways, because it might be that there's more than one charge on the table. Okay, and the importance of that is that often it can take things out of the magistrates' court and up to the big house, where the sentencing powers are increased. So it's just looking about those things in a new way and really maximising the opportunities that we have to gather as much evidence as possible. So great, yeah, there's quite a few of the obvious things there. There's a few things that people haven't got, but they're all explained on the training. So yeah, thank you for that.
And I think it's got people considering other things, like actually what kind of cars do they have, and are they of equal quality and value, or is there a big discrepancy? So recognizing that imbalance, I think it's really helpful, isn't it? Because you're starting to apply that type of thinking to other situations and circumstances.
Okay. We just want to promote that conversation, because if you see something and it you just think, that's not right, and you just ask the question, you're either going to get the answer that you can discount it as part of what you're doing, or actually you can get more information as a result. Police officers are human beings at the end of the day, but because they wear a uniform, we need to make sure we have that consistent response, and sometimes the sheer amount of work that an officer's done in a day, maybe they're going to an address where they've been before, and they'll go thinking, well, I know what's going to happen here because it's happened before. And then, that's the response they get from the victim. And then they say to themselves, well, I knew it, and they walk out. But what we want to do here is just encourage them to keep an open mind. because if you go to an address with a preconceived idea of what it's going to be like, you might miss those other things that are in plain sight. And we want to avoid that. Okay. So we have a bit of fun around the body worn video. There's usually a prize for the team that gets the most right. It's often Jaffa cakes or something else like that. And then we start to look at the legislation, and the way that we look at that is through 4 case studies. Now, it wasn't lost on us when we put the training together that this is something that can affect all people, the particular nuances when it came to Black and minority ethnic people as well. So we made sure that we included a range of case studies that covered a whole different range of possibilities, offences and people that were involved. And then we paired those case studies with the exhibits that you saw in the house, but also with the CPS guidance around coercion and control, around the offence, section 76 SCA. And what we wanted to do here was we wanted to help officers understand what the CPS might be looking for in order to agree a charge and to present their evidence in that way. And when you look at the non-exhaustive list in that guidance of the range of things that could evidence coercion and control, you've just got a massive list of things that just scream economic abuse. But until I started working with SEA to put this training together, it was the first time that I'd considered that. But having done that, it really becomes clear about how you can gather the evidence of the adverse effect. Because from talking to CPS colleagues, that's the bit that they say that's missing. That officers are very good at getting most stuff in a statement until it comes to the effect it's had on the victim, until it comes to evidencing that bit, when maybe it's covered in a paragraph or a few sentences and it's just not enough. So by understanding more what the CPS need, what our hope was that the evidence would be presented to them in a way that would also be easy for them to see that it had been gathered and improve those outcomes. What also became quite apparent was that if we're talking about criminal benefit, and we usually are with resources, with money and with other property, then you could talk to your financial investigation unit just to get their kind of opinion on what you've got, because there were similarities between CCB and Section 1 modern slavery. Now, modern slavery is automatically included in Schedule 2 of POCA, which is the Proceeds of Crime Act 2002. And as a result of putting the training together, we started work just before the lockdown on looking at whether CCB should be as well. Because when we're talking about CCB and economic abuse, and so often quite high value items, then it might be a power of seizure, and there might be something that the court can do in relation to giving victims back some of what they've lost. And that was really quite interesting because that just kind of, there were 2 things that dropped out of this training. The first one was that if you understand economic abuse, you're going to understand CCB a lot better and how to evidence it. And the other thing was that the potential in terms of other legislation to help you achieve better outcomes for victims. And then some of the other stuff we looked at in relation to, just your simple powers around Section 19 of PACE, and even powers around one of the oldest offences that we've got, breach of the peace, because often when a victim has left their perpetrator, they will go back because they don't have the resources to survive outside of the relationship, the economic resources. But yet we know that separation can be a high risk time. But some options for those victims, the only option they've got is to go back to the perpetrator. So that's the real issue. And then we consider those reports that come in as breach of the peace jobs, where people who have left relationships where there's an abuser, and they want to stay away need things like their passports and their driving license and their other documents and details, so that they can get things like mortgages or rent or other things. We see those jobs where victims are asking the police to help them get that stuff back, but they're fairly low down on the list of priorities of the day-to-day stuff that's also coming in. But we kind of need to rethink about that, because if we want those people to stay away and stay safe, then it might be one of the best things that we could do for them, is to help get them access to the property they need to continue to do that. So we just kind of finish off the training by going through all those other things that you might be able to use. Now this workshop is part of a number of workshops. So forces that have adopted the DA Matters Change programme have a champions network, and I'm the lead for those networks around the country, and we periodically get together to look at knowledge gaps and CPD stuff for their champions, usually multi-agency stuff, getting people together to break down those blockages. And there's a whole range of workshops we develop now that can be delivered to those forces officers and staff to help them understand, some of the other issues that go on within domestic abuse. So we've got this one on economic abuse. We've got one on investigating links between CCB and suicide, how domestic abuse affects older people, rural domestic abuse, and how to support male victims, that kind of thing. This is probably, the lockdown kind of got in the way of the others. This is probably the best delivered one so far. But what we want to do is just kind of emulate what we get in DA Matters, which is a police expert and a victim expert standing together to give the information in simple terms. Same here with economic abuse. It's almost like booking an expert to come and talk to your officers and staff for a few hours, and the value of that over more generic training is huge. As Jasbinder is now going to talk about.
So it's always really important, isn't it, that we have an opportunity, and a really vital opportunity, to create a really good learning opportunity and make a difference. We wanted the training to help officers do their job better and to really build on their existing knowledge and skills and have that strength-based approach to the work. And it's great to be able to share with you from the interim evaluation some of the outcomes that we've achieved. So 6 months following the training, 93% of learners understood economic abuse and how it fits within the broader context of domestic abuse and what safeguarding actions you can take as a responder. 93% of learners were willing to recommend the training to a colleague, and 98% of learners reported a good understanding of the impact of economic abuse on victims, including the long-term impact on the quality of life and safety. Pete, did you want to comment on any of those? Okay. When we're thinking about that long term, the quality and safety, quite recently we've been working with traditional and non-traditional domestic abuse stakeholders nationally to raise their awareness of economic abuse. And it really is that contribution that the police can make as part of a wider network of safety, because we start to recognise particular vulnerabilities and how to address them together. So it's great to recognise there's a long-term role that we all have to play as well. 98% of learners understood the tactics used by perpetrators when economically abusing their victims. We recognise that there are particular patterns. Perpetrators' aim is to maintain control within this context of fear very often. And so there are going to be tactics around restriction, exploitation and sabotage. And so where you can start to recognise those patterns and start identifying perpetrators' behaviours, that really goes a long way in validating a victim survivor's experience as well, that this is something that has happened to them. 89% had good knowledge of the legal definition of economic abuse and also the relevant legislation that can be used to support prosecutions, and that shared understanding of what is economic abuse. Actually, I thought it was just financial abuse. oh, okay, this really does make more sense, because actually where we are only looking at financial abuse, which focuses on that fraud, the coercion, the theft, we're missing the much bigger picture. So being able to recognise that definition and understand it is really helpful.
And, you know, stepping back from that tendency to view individual incidents or crimes in isolation and actually look for the bigger picture. It's really important to risk assessment, but it's also important for any offence that where you've got a pattern of behaviour, or whether it's repeated or continuous, you know, take a step back, have a look at it in the wider context of what's going on. That sometimes can be difficult, but that's what you've got to do if you want to, if you know, really want to push this forwards.
Absolutely. And with the inclusion of economic abuse in the domestic abuse bill, it means that actually we all have a shared understanding of that definition and work together to safeguard victim survivors. 91% of learners understood the evidence gathering opportunities for economic abuse, including those specific types and patterns of evidence as well. You know, somebody, would they call the police if the perpetrator broke their spectacles? But actually, when you recognise just how important it is to do that reporting, it's validating for victim survivors, and important that police reinforce that message. So responses from the police.
Okay, so with DA matters, what we will do is we will survey the officers who have attended the training to see if there's been any immediate change as a result of the training they delivered, what they thought they knew and what they know now. And then at around about the 6-month point, we will survey them again to see if anything's changed as a result of the training. So, and what we hope to see is that it's made a difference. It's not just something they came to for one day, where a box is ticked and they've moved on. So initially, the initial responses from those who attended the training, things like, so the top one, that's a chief inspector who was responsible for quality of training that that force delivered to their officers. And what she had to say was that, you know, she learned something as a result of the training, and it was an excellent resource, which was thumbs up. And the officers appreciated the case studies and the physical exhibits, so relating that to real life as much as possible. Really good examples of case studies, made it more interesting and impactful, and provides new ways to best support victims, but also how to deal with suspects. Now, a number of officers felt that this training, which was offered to them as champions, should actually be offered to all officers and staff at a much earlier stage. And this one kind of resonated with me a bit, because back in 2005, when I became the Leicestershire lead for domestic abuse, I remember sitting next to the CEO of Women's Aid in Leicestershire, and I was telling her all about the things that I was going to do in order to improve the lives of victims of domestic violence, as we called it back then. And she said, well, that's all very well, Pete. What about coercive and controlling behaviour? And I was kind of clueless. I didn't know about it at all at that stage. And of course, that's still 10 years before it becomes an offence in this country. But, you know, what officers are saying is that we could do with getting this out to people at a much earlier stage, because it's not, in my experience, it's not that people don't want to do a good job. It's just about the difficulties of keeping them current and giving them the information they need in order to make those outcomes.
So it reminds us, all of this, reminding us why are we doing this work? Why is it so important? And as we saw in the examples, often the economic abuse isn't the priority, it's the long term. But it isn't just something that is at the end of the list. We can't keep people physically safe if we can't keep them economically safe. We know from our research that economic barriers to leaving mean that women stay with an abusive partner for longer and therefore experience more harm. Women who experience economic abuse are 5 times more likely to experience physical violence than those who don't. And women experiencing coercive control who also experience economic abuse are at an increased risk of being killed.
So the pandemic got in the way of it a little bit, but we've recently sent out the requests for those who attended the training nearly a year on now to see whether that had made any difference to their practice. And I'm just going to read out some of the responses. So what we've got here is 9 out of 10 felt the training had improved their response to victims of domestic abuse. And there's a quote: "Since the training I've attended a number of addresses and taken reports from people who had been controlled both financially and emotionally. I realised that in the past that was hidden, and the training was helpful to help me uncover that. From the input, I recognised some of the signs to look out for. I would have previously missed these. 3/4 had sought the opinion of other specialist teams within their force in relation to how they were dealing with the job, which was great. Drawing on other departmental expertise to support the investigation. I didn't realise that I could do this." Officers were also saying that they were filing more coercive controlling behaviour reports that contained elements of economic abuse. So I think the research at the moment says that it's about 60% CCB, successful CCB, that has economic abuse within it. I don't know if over time, as we become more adept at picking it up, that will change. But people are saying that the training directly relates to their role and their responsibilities. So, as we couldn't really ask for any more, could we, Jasbinder, in terms of getting that training done?
So we have a couple of questions, Pete. Can you see them?
Mm-hmm.
And very often, I think the first one, in cases where the victim is used to the abuse and cannot recognise that they are in an abusive situation and someone reports for them, how do you help the victim?
Well, what we have to do here is, sometimes third parties do report on behalf of victims, and the important thing to do is not dismiss that or diminish it in any way because it hasn't come from the victim. Because, as we talked about earlier, some people feel unable to report. And it's about looking at those opportunities to gather the evidence, to take that forward, perhaps as an evidence-led prosecution, that don't rely on the victim making a statement. So in the training room, the easiest way I can put this, in the training room, I will always ask officers if they remember why they joined the job in the first place. So for me, all those years ago, it was a paper booklet that you had to complete in block capitals and black ink. More often these days, it's something that they do online. But they'll always say things like, they joined the job to help people and to make a difference, to keep people safe, to give something back to the community. When I joined, I said it was to fight crime, catch criminals and send them to prison. The language might be slightly different, but the sentiments are still there. It's about sort of keeping people safe, and it's about doing what's right. So I'll ask them the question: did you say you would do all those things as long as the victim made a statement? And the answer is no, because before you join the job, it doesn't matter if the victim gives a statement or not. You're going to do it anyway because it's the right thing to do. But when you join the job, you become an agent of the criminal justice system, and you start to learn about your part in the process. But the problem is, I guess, if the second question out of your mouth is, "Are you going to give us a statement?" then you're thinking about the process and not the person, and that is a problem because it needs to be the other way around. Because why does the process exist in the first place? So we should be thinking about the person first and the process second. Now, kind of feminist academics will probably have explained that over the years more eloquently than I have, but it's just a no-brainer. Always remind people, why did you join the job in the first place? It was to keep people safe because it was the right thing to do. Then it becomes more about what the victim's rights and needs are than what the process demands. So basically the short answer is we will always look for those other evidential opportunities, and if necessary, take that case forward, without the support of the victim.
Thank you. The next one is a comment more, and it's about a policeman told me 3 years ago, it's a shame you can't get on better after hearing disclosure of family abuse. And this is about, it would be great if 100% of officers had training. I feel I got a person who wasn't trained yet.
And it's kind of always sad to hear when people have had a bad experience. Kind of touches on what we mentioned quite early on in the webinar about assuming that somebody is able to do things, because often they're not, and we kind of miss something if we have that expectation. Yeah, I believe it would also be great if 100% of officers got trained on economic abuse, but there are issues due to austerity with the number of officers that there are around, and getting 25 officers into a training room for this session, is quite a big ask in the resource demand model. The other thing, of course, when it comes to training is that I'm a big advocate of multi-agency training, because the barriers really do come down when the people who say that they're all working together for the same aim actually see where the problems are and what can be done to resolve them.
Thank you, Pete. So there's a question from Amy. This one probably one relevant for me, but do you train housing officers working for local housing services and councils? We in Wales did ever ask and act training, and I've delivered quite a number of housing associations. You've mentioned a few things that I've never thought of raising with them. I can raise awareness in the safeguarding and MARAC areas. We recognise actually that the impact in terms of housing is a key theme. We do a lot of work at surviving economic abuse, particularly around privately owned housing, because we know that there are particular perpetrator tactics around housing, and people who are private homeowners often are perhaps a little bit more isolated from the sources of support, maybe not having an understanding maybe of their access and rights and entitlements, about maybe going to a refuge, what would happen to my house, I still have to pay the mortgage. So we have particular work streams around that, as well as the social housing response. And we've got the Domestic Abuse and Housing Alliance, of which Surviving Economic Abuse are members of. And it's really about improving overall that social housing response to domestic abuse, with a focus within that on economic abuse. So certainly do get in touch with us, and we have some specific training opportunities. And often in the social housing sector, we will work with income teams as well, because they will pick up a red flag to domestic abuse is rent arrears, but sometimes there are going to be systems and structures that are inadvertently facilitating the economic abuse, and we want to make sure that all professionals are aware of those.
Okay, next question from Jasbinder Kaur. I just want to share that there is also economic abuse that affects ethnic women of Muslim background. I've written at length to SEA founder to ask her to review this. Can we get an update if there is scope for this? Well, I guess before I hand over to you, Jasbinder, I'll just reiterate that we were highly aware of how it affected different communities, different people, different ethnic groups, weren't we, when we were putting the training together, to make sure that the training reflected some of those differences.
Absolutely. And when we are working as practitioners, part of our response is always going to be about understanding and knowing your communities, having those networks, not waiting till there's a crisis in which to engage with people, but that understanding of knowing who's there, because perpetrators will tailor make the abuse, and they will target any of those individual differences and circumstances as well.
One from an anonymous attendee. He said at the beginning of the training about believing the victim. What are your thoughts on the review undertaken in April 2017 by Sir Richard Enrique in relation to Operation Midland, and the recommendation that the instruction to believe a victim's account should cease? It should be the duty of an officer interviewing a complainant to investigate the facts objectively and impartially, and with an open mind from the outset of the investigation. Well, anonymous attendee, I think that's a more wordy way of saying what I said, wasn't it? believe what you're being told until you find evidence to the contrary. Do I need to say any more? I spent the best part of my career being victim focused. With a colleague, Joe Ingle in Leicestershire, we developed the victim satisfaction work for DA that the Home Secretary mandated that all forces, should adopt. In all of the years that I've been a police officer, I have believed what I have been told until I have found evidence to the contrary. That means that the victim feels that they're being believed and respected, but I'm also doing what I need to do as a police officer, which is look at those other things, gathering the evidence to prove as much as disprove.
And Wilhelmina, do you work with police in Europe? Also, since much of Europe is still behind in awareness regarding coercive control and economic abuse and in legislation, we could, I think is the very quick answer to that. Surviving economic abuse has international networks, and certainly we'd be happy to support you and explore further opportunities to do that. Pete, do you want to talk a little bit about Gibraltar and any overlaps where we're slightly further afield?
Yeah, so I was fortunate enough in the summer to deliver DA Matters training to the Royal Gibraltar Police, which was fabulous. There were times when I had to remember that I was actually at work, so pleasant was it out there. Yeah, we'll travel anywhere, I think, to get the message across.
Absolutely. We've got a comment from Janice about the NPCC have agreed a new definition of belief following the Enrique's review. Again, is that similar to what we were saying before?
I stand by what I said. The CPI in 1996 is quite clear in relation to what the role of a police officer is, and my interpretation of that is that I'm going to believe what I am told until I find evidence to the contrary.
Right. We did have a couple of hand raises. I have to apologise. I don't know how to invite somebody who's raising their hand to speak. I wonder if I can just encourage you to put a question or a comment in the question and answer if you did still want to raise something. I'll just give you a moment to do that. So apologies, I did notice your hands were going up, but we didn't see any of the comments. Do feel free to keep adding the questions. So for more information, Pete, would you like to?
So if you're one of the adopted police forces, or if you'd like more information about the workshops, then jovan.kent at jovan.kent@safelives.org.uk would be the email address for you to make contact with, going in through SafeLives. And then that's Jovan, the operations manager at SafeLives, and then Jasbinder for the SEA it would be.
And what we would encourage you all to do is have a look at the Surviving Economic Abuse website. Some of the research we mentioned, you might have remembered that the 3 diagrams. Our work into plain sight has been looking at successful prosecutions of controlling and coercive behaviour. So that will be particularly important and interesting for many of you. On our website, we have the Tools to Thrive, which are tailor-made resources for victim survivors. It might also be if you're concerned about a friend or a relative and you want to have a conversation about economic abuse with them. It's to support you to increase your understanding. But there are going to be those specific resources of finding a safe place to live, grants and financial help, or separating your finances from an abuser. And these are really going to be there and available. So if somebody can actually do a lot of self-help, but also we have a tools to support section as well. So for practitioners who want to improve their confidence and knowledge and understanding of how best to support somebody, we've got a range of resources. We also have some very specific ones in terms of COVID, because we recognise that current context and the increase of reporting and the increased experience of economic abuse is important to recognise. So the examples with tools to support, supporting customers experiencing economic abuse in the coronavirus outbreak, supporting customers experiencing economic abuse, and that again is linked in with the whole housing domestic abuse approach. And conversation kits for banks. Currently, one of our colleagues is on secondment working with one of the banking groups and supporting them to consider their response to economic abuse and embedding good practice throughout all of those. So if you would like to book any of the training and find out a little bit more, certainly do get in touch with us at Surviving Economic Abuse, or as Jovan from SafeLives, as Pete mentioned earlier. The webinars will be recorded and are available for you to listen into at a later date as well. And if you'd like to learn more, we've got one more webinar, and that's tomorrow, and that's economic abuse and children. And there is still an opportunity for you to sign in and join us on that. Before we go, we still have some time and we've got another question here. I deliver multi-agency skills training on CCB and often have police on the course. They often raise concerns about avoiding asking what they call leading questions. Any tips for how to add to our response to this? We can famously say, Pete, that you're on mute.
It had to happen. I've got a whole range of questions, suitable open questions in relation to, encouraging victims to talk about CCB. I can provide those. I can put them on my Twitter page if necessary. Sometimes you do need to ask closed questions, and sometimes officers feel that in the -RIC some of the questions are a little bit leading, but it's about the context in which you ask the questions, along with the understanding of why those questions are being asked in the first place. But the other thing, the other advice I'd give, so Nicola Sharp-Jeffs did a version of the Duluth Power and Control Wheel specifically for economic abuse back in 2008. Which is available. But one of the things that I found very effective in my service was just to put a copy of the original Duluth Power and Control Wheel under the nose of a victim and say, can you see yourself in here? Or, what's it like for you? So, there's kind of many ways that we can do that. Hopefully that answers the question.
And Yasmin, whenever we are able to roll out free training, we always do. And that's because we do get the support of some funders to do that. So it's always worth having a look on our website, and we will promote any free training opportunities on our website and also via our social media pages as well.
Okay.
Yeah. Great. Okay. Just there is still time for more questions if anybody wanted to add. That the hand raise, I think, was just inadvertently a hand raise and couldn't put it down. So that's just us getting used to the technology. Okay. So Pete, any closing comments from you?
Just really to thank SEA for giving me the opportunity to work with you on the original project and to learn. At the age of 56, I learned loads working with you guys. It's definitely made me a better trainer and investigator as a result. So I'd just like to say thanks for that.
Brilliant. And it's been a pleasure for us to really have that opportunity to influence some key opportunities and improve that professional response that we work so hard to achieve. Okay. Thank you all so much. Do keep in touch. And if you have any questions, please feel free to email info@survivingeconomicabuse.org. Okay. Stay safe. Thank you. Bye now.